You're listening to the Apotheora Conversations, a speculative fiction podcast set in an alternate timeline diverging from real events on the 1st of March 2026. All voices and content are AI generated.
My mother called me from Penang on a Tuesday morning before the Indian Commerce Ministry had said a single word publicly, and she asked me, "Wei Lin, why has the rice price already moved?" I was sitting in my office, surrounded by the same datasets the algorithms had used, and I realized I could not answer her honestly without explaining that someone's model had already priced in a sovereign decision that had not yet been announced.
Welcome to the Apotheora Conversations. I'm Paula Reese. That was Dr. Wei Lin Ooi, a former regional commodity exchange surveillance official, now an associate professor of financial regulation at the Center for Financial Regulation Studies in Singapore. In early December, U.S. commodity regulators moved against an AI-driven commodity intelligence platform, alleging it used satellite imagery, shipping transponder data, and Bayesian inference models to systematically front-run government food export announcements during the 2026 food crisis. The estimated profits, somewhere between $280 and $340 million, extracted from rice and wheat futures. Today we trace how a satellite photograph of a wheat field in Rajasthan becomes money taken from the world's poorest rice buyers. Dr. Ooi, let's start at the very beginning of the data chain. A satellite passes over Rajasthan. What does it actually see? And how does that image eventually become a futures position?
Commercial Earth observation satellites from companies like Planet Labs or Maxar capture multispectral imagery of agricultural regions on a regular cadence, sometimes daily. What these AI platforms did was build models that estimate crop yields from vegetation indices derived from those images. You measure chlorophyll absorption, leaf area, water stress indicators. If you have 3 or 4 years of training data matching those indices against actual harvest outcomes, your model can estimate whether a wheat crop in Uttar Pradesh or Rajasthan will fall short of government projections, weeks before any official assessment is released.
But a crop stress estimate alone does not get you to front-running a policy announcement.
No, and that is the step most people miss. The satellite data gives you a yield estimate. The profit comes from predicting what the government will do about it. For that, you need a second data source. These platforms were ingesting AIS data, the automatic identification system that every large vessel broadcasts. You track bulk carriers and grain ships through the Strait of Malacca, through port approaches at Kandla or Mundra. If you see vessel loading patterns changing, fewer ships loading, longer port dwell times, you have a signal that export logistics are tightening before any official restriction is gazetted.
So you layer crop stress data on top of shipping behavior. And then what happens?
Then the Bayesian inference model synthesizes these signals with historical precedent. It asks a composite question. Given this level of crop stress, given this pattern of port activity, given the political calendar and the current government's historical response function, what is the probability that the Commerce Ministry announces an export ban or a minimum export price within the next 5 to 10 days? When that probability crossed a threshold, the platform built futures positions: long rice, long wheat, sometimes short if they predicted a surprise lifting of restrictions. The positions were built 48 to 72 hours before the announcements, which is an eternity in commodity futures.
Every individual data source you just described is publicly available, correct?
Every single one. Satellite imagery is commercial. AIS data is broadcast openly. Government calendars are public. Historical policy responses can be researched by any analyst with a spreadsheet. That is exactly the legal problem. The CFTC's traditional framework for market manipulation requires either false information, wash trading, or trading on material non-public information. None of those categories fit neatly here. What these platforms did was synthesize individually public data points into a composite signal that no human trader could replicate without the same computational infrastructure. The CFTC is now arguing that the synthesis itself creates an informational asymmetry functionally equivalent to insider knowledge.
You were cited in the regulator's preliminary staff report. What role did your research play?
I published a paper in early 2025 describing hypothetical scenarios very close to what actually happened. At my prior exchange, before I left in 2024, I had flagged unusual positioning patterns in rough rice futures, where open interest would spike in ways that correlated suspiciously well with subsequent policy announcements from major exporting nations. At the time, I could not prove causation, but the patterns were consistent enough that I wrote an internal memo recommending enhanced surveillance for what I called predictive front-running. When I moved to the center, I expanded that work into a formal research paper. The regulator's staff cited it because it provided the analytical framework for identifying the pattern across their own data.
One platform reportedly settled for a 9-figure sum, while the other is contesting the action. What does the defense look like?
The defense will be straightforward. We traded on our own proprietary analysis of public information, which is exactly what every hedge fund, every commodity trading house, every sell-side analyst does every day. They will argue that superior analysis is not manipulation. And honestly, that argument has significant legal merit. The entire structure of capital markets is built on the premise that superior analysis of public information is legitimate and socially useful because it makes prices more efficient. The regulator is essentially arguing that there is a threshold of analytical superiority beyond which efficiency becomes exploitation. That is a genuinely novel legal theory, and I am not confident it will survive judicial review.
You sound almost sympathetic to the defense.
I am rigorous about distinguishing what I believe should be illegal from what the law currently says is illegal, because those are two very different questions. As a former regulator, I can tell you the law has gaps that urgently need closing. As a researcher, I believe we need entirely new frameworks. But as someone who watched this unfold from both sides, the human cost is not abstract to me, because my family is in the rice trade.
Tell me about your family's business in Penang.
My parents ran a rice wholesale operation for more than 30 years. My father started it in the late 1990s, buying from importers and distributing to provision shops and restaurants across the northern region of Malaysia. It is not a large operation. They move maybe 40 or 50 tons a month. My mother still runs it. She knows the price of Thai jasmine and Vietnamese broken rice the way most people know the weather forecast. She feels the market in her hands every morning when the suppliers call.
You mentioned a phone call from your mother on the morning before India's Commerce Ministry made its October announcement. Can you walk me through what she said and what you understood in that moment?
She called at about 9 in the morning, Penang time. She told me her supplier had raised the wholesale price by 11% overnight, and she wanted to know if I had heard anything because the news had not reported any change in Indian export policy. I checked immediately. The ministry announcement did not come for another 31 hours, but the futures market had already moved. The position building had started 2 days earlier. By the time the actual restriction was gazetted, the price adjustment had already propagated through physical supply chains across Southeast Asia. My mother was paying a price that had been set by an algorithm that knew what the Indian government was going to do before the Indian government told anyone. I sat there looking at my own research, the same models I had described in my paper, and I realized I was looking at my mother's cost of doing business. The dataset and the provision shop were the same thing.
Every dollar of those estimated profits, running into the hundreds of millions. Where did it actually come from in economic terms?
It came from the spread between the pre-announcement price and the post-announcement price. But that spread is not free money appearing from nowhere. It is extracted from the participants on the other side of those trades, which in commodity futures ultimately traces back to physical buyers and sellers. The importers in the Philippines, in Bangladesh, in Cuba, the ones buying rice and wheat to feed their populations, they paid fractionally more because the algorithmic traders had already captured the price adjustment. You can debate the per unit magnitude, but across hundreds of millions of tons of traded grain, even a fraction of a percent translates into real money taken from the people who can least afford to pay it. Those are the people queuing for rice in Manila and Dhaka.
An Asian regulator filed parallel proceedings. How does that approach differ from what the U.S. regulator is attempting?
That regulator has broader statutory authority under its market abuse statute to address what the law calls a false or misleading appearance of trading. The threshold is lower than the U.S. manipulation standard. It does not need to prove intent to manipulate. It can act on the basis that the trading pattern itself created a misleading market signal. That is a significant difference, and I expect those proceedings to move faster and potentially establish precedent that the American case simply cannot, given the higher evidentiary bar in U.S. federal court.
If you could design the regulatory framework from the ground up, knowing what you know now, what would it include?
I would require registration and transparency for any entity using AI-derived predictive models to trade commodity futures above a defined position threshold. Not banning the analysis, that would be impractical and probably counterproductive, but requiring disclosure of the methodology, similar to how we already require large position reporting. If your model is predicting sovereign policy actions and you are building positions on those predictions, the market and the regulators should know you exist and how you operate. Whether we also need position limits or mandatory cooling off periods for AI-derived commodity trades is a harder question, but we need to start building these frameworks between food crises, not scrambling during one.
Dr. Wei Lin Ooi is an associate professor of financial regulation at the Center for Financial Regulation Studies in Singapore and a former financial markets regulator. Her research on predictive front-running in commodity markets was cited in a U.S. commodity regulator's December 2026 enforcement action. This has been the Apotheora Conversations. I'm Paula Reese. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paula. And I hope this conversation reaches the people writing the rules, not just the ones trading around them.